The text came in at 11:47 p.m., sharp and careless, the kind of message written without a second thought, like the sender already knew there would be no consequences. You're banned from Thanksgiving, idiot. Don't embarrass us. No greeting. No explanation. No pause. Just those words glowing on my phone in the dark of my apartment, lighting up the ceiling fan slowly turning above me, the hum of it mixing with the quiet hum of a life I'd built without ever realizing how much of it was still chained to the people who raised me. I read the message 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because some small part of me expected it to change, to soften, to reveal itself as a joke or a mistake. It didn't. My mother, Linda Parker, had always had a talent for turning cruelty into something casual, something she could later deny or reframe as tough love. And I knew from experience that if I responded emotionally, she would win twice, once by hurting me, and again by making me look unstable. So I didn't reply. I locked the phone, set it face down on the table, and sat there longer than I want to admit, feeling something inside me finally stop begging. People talk about breaking points like explosions, like shouting or tears or slam doors, but mine felt like the opposite. It felt like a door quietly closing somewhere deep in my chest, sealing off a part of me that had been keeping hope alive long past its expiration date. I was the kind of son families like mine never brag about because my usefulness was never flashy. I wasn't loud like my older brother Mark, who had learned early that confidence could disguise irresponsibility, or fragile like my younger sister Emily, whose constant crises kept everyone orbiting her emotions. I was dependable. I handled things. When Dad was alive, he used to call me the steady one. And when he died, that steadiness became an expectation rather than a compliment. I took care of paperwork during the funeral week while everyone else grieved publicly. I organized accounts, talked to lawyers, filed documents, explained numbers no one else wanted to understand. Over time, it just became assumed that if something went wrong, I would quietly fix it. If money was short, I would float it. If a bill was late, I would handle it. If someone needed help, I would be the one who didn't ask questions first. And in my family, the people who don't ask questions are the easiest to exploit. Thanksgiving had always been a performance in our house. A chance for my mother to play the role of matriarch, for Mark to tell exaggerated stories about his business ventures, for Emily to receive sympathy for whatever problem she was currently drowning in. I usually sat at the edge of the table, smiling at the right moments, listening more than speaking, absorbing the subtle digs and comparisons that never quite crossed the line into anything that could be confronted without causing a scene. This year was supposed to be different. I'd taken time off work. I'd even bought a plane ticket early, knowing prices spiked closer to the holiday. I hadn't told anyone yet, because experience had taught me that anticipation in my family often turned into leverage. And then the text came, erasing me with a sentence like I was a problem they could simply delete. What my mother didn't know, what none of them seemed to fully understand, was that the quiet son they had just disinvited was the same one who'd been quietly stitching their lives together behind the scenes for years. My career in financial systems consulting wasn't something I talked about much at family gatherings because it bored them, but it had taught me how dependency works, how modern comfort is built on layers of invisible support that most people never think about until it disappears. I understood how autopayments could create the illusion of stability, how shared accounts blurred responsibility, how temporary help became permanent expectation. And sitting there in my dark apartment, phone face down, I realized something with startling clarity. Almost everything they relied on passed through me in some way. Not because I'd planned it that way, but because I'd allowed it, thinking that being needed was the same as being loved. I got up and turned on the light. The room looked different under it, less forgiving, more real. I opened my laptop and didn't check my messages. I didn't pace or rant or rehearse arguments I'd never get to finish. Instead, I opened a spreadsheet and started writing names. Mark, Emily, Mom, utilities, insurance, phone plans, streaming services, property taxes, temporary loans that had never been repaid, subscriptions I'd forgotten were even mine because no one ever said thank you anymore. It wasn't rage guiding my hand, it was focus. Each line I typed felt like reclaiming something I'd given away without realizing the cost. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was restoring balance. By the time the sun came up, I had a list so clean it almost scared me. I showered, dressed, drank coffee, and went to work like it was any other day. The difference was that for the first time, I wasn't carrying my family's weight in my chest. I knew what would happen once I started making calls, once I logged into accounts and changed permissions, once I let systems do what they were designed to do when support is withdrawn. But knowing didn't make me hesitate, because somewhere between that midnight text and that quiet morning, I had accepted a truth I'd been avoiding for years. If my absence from Thanksgiving was so easy for them, my presence in their lives had been nothing more than a convenience. And convenience, once removed, has a way of revealing exactly who you've been to people all along. By late morning, the first cracks began to show, though I wasn't there to see them, and that felt important somehow, like the universe finally letting consequences unfold without my supervision. I was at my desk, answering emails, reviewing reports, pretending to be the same calm professional I'd always been, while quietly opening one account after another during breaks, removing my name, canceling temporary arrangements that had long since fossilized into entitlement. None of it was impulsive. Every step followed rules, notice periods, clauses I'd read years earlier when I first agreed to help. I'd always told myself I was being smart, protecting myself just in case. I hadn't realized that just in case was another way of admitting I never felt safe in my own family. The first call came at 12:13 p.m. from Mark. I let it ring. A voicemail followed, casual, annoyed, like he assumed I was responsible for a minor inconvenience. He laughed as he spoke, said something about his card being declined at a gas station, joked that I must have forgotten to move money again. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask why I hadn't replied to Mom's text. He assumed my silence was a technical glitch, not a decision. That assumption sat heavy with me as I deleted the voicemail without responding. An hour later, the calls came faster. Emily's name flashed across my screen 3 times in a row while I was in a meeting. I muted the phone and kept listening to my boss talk about quarterly projections, feeling a strange dissonance between the controlled, predictable world of my job and the emotional chaos I knew was starting to boil back home. When I checked my messages afterward, Emily's voicemails were already sliding from irritation into panic. Her phone service had been shut off mid-conversation, she said, and she didn't understand why. She sounded embarrassed, like she'd been exposed in front of someone. She asked if I could just fix it like last time, her voice catching on the word fix, as if it was something I owed her rather than something I'd been gifting for years. I didn't reply. I logged into the carrier account instead and confirmed the cancellation. The system didn't ask why. It didn't care about family history or hurt feelings. It just processed the request. By the time Mom called, the tone had shifted entirely. Her first voicemail was sharp, accusing, already rewriting history to position herself as the victim of my imagined immaturity. She demanded to know why bills weren't going through, why the cable was out, why the bank was suddenly making mistakes. She didn't mention the text she'd sent me the night before. She didn't apologize. She spoke like a manager reprimanding an employee who'd stepped out of line. Listening to her, I felt something detach further inside me, like a thread snapping cleanly rather than tearing. I realized then how often she'd relied on my fear of confrontation, my need to keep the peace, to maintain control without ever raising her voice. Control doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like confidence that you'll be obeyed. As the afternoon dragged on, the voicemails piled up. Confusion gave way to urgency. Mark's jokes disappeared, replaced by irritation and then outright anger when his insurance company informed him his policy had lapsed. Emily started crying openly, her voice breaking as she talked about her landlord and the late rent notice taped to her door. Mom called repeatedly, sometimes hanging up without leaving a message, sometimes leaving rambling ones where she talked herself in circles, trying to justify things I hadn't accused her of yet. I watched the missed call count climb with a detached fascination, like observing a storm through thick glass. Each ring felt like confirmation of something I'd known but never allowed myself to fully accept. My value to them had always been transactional. As long as things worked, I was invisible. The moment they didn't, I was indispensable. What they didn't know, what made the panic escalate faster than they expected, was how interconnected their lives had become with systems I'd set up after Dad's death. When he passed, everything had been chaos. Bills scattered, accounts half forgotten, responsibilities unclear. Mom had been overwhelmed, Mark had been unreliable, Emily had been inconsolable. I stepped in because someone had to. I consolidated accounts, automated payments, created buffers so no one had to worry about due dates or overdrafts. I told myself I was doing it to help Mom grieve, to keep the family stable. Over time, that stability became a given. They stopped asking questions. They stopped checking balances. They stopped thinking about consequences at all. Comfort has a way of dulling awareness, and I had unknowingly dulled theirs completely. Around 5 p.m., I finally listened to one voicemail all the way through, not because it demanded a response, but because I needed to hear it to be sure. Mom's voice had changed. The sharp edges were gone, replaced by something closer to fear. She asked me to call her back, said there must be some misunderstanding, said we could talk about Thanksgiving later. That last part stuck with me. Even now, she framed my exclusion as a discussion point, not an offense. It was still negotiable in her mind, still something she believed she had the authority to grant or revoke. I paused the message before it ended and stared at my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. For years, I'd accepted that framing without question. Being invited back into the family had always felt like a privilege rather than a right, something I earned by being useful, quiet, and forgiving. Hearing her voice crack like that, knowing exactly why, made something solidify inside me. I didn't call back. Instead, I drove home in silence, letting the city lights blur past, thinking about all the small moments I'd ignored because confronting them would have meant admitting how unequal things really were. The holidays had always been the worst for that, amplifying every imbalance, every unspoken rule. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, my phone showed 43 missed calls. By the time I made dinner, it was over 60. Each notification felt less urgent than the last, like echoes fading into the distance. I wasn't enjoying their distress. That mattered to me. This wasn't about punishment or humiliation. It was about withdrawal, about stepping back and letting reality rush in to fill the space I'd been occupying for too long. Late that night, when the count hit 87, I turned the phone off completely. The silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. For the first time since Dad's death, I wasn't on call. I wasn't bracing for the next crisis, the next favor disguised as an emergency. I sat on my couch and thought about Thanksgiving, about the empty seat that would be there whether I showed up or not. And I realized something else that surprised me with its clarity. I didn't miss them. I missed the idea of a family that had never really existed, one where care flowed both ways, where love wasn't conditional on usefulness. That family had been a story I told myself to justify staying. And like all stories built on denial, it collapsed the moment reality applied pressure. As I went to bed that night, the weight I'd been carrying for years felt noticeably lighter. I knew this wasn't over. I knew confrontation was coming, that consequences always attract attention eventually. But I also knew that whatever happened next would happen on different terms. The systems were already in motion, indifferent and precise, and for once I wasn't going to rush in to stop them. If being banned from Thanksgiving meant being freed from the role I'd been trapped in, then maybe that text wasn't an insult at all. Maybe it was the trigger. Thanksgiving morning arrived without ceremony for me. No alarms, no frantic travel, no rehearsed smiles packed into an overnight bag. I woke up late, the apartment quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than lonely, and for a moment I forgot what day it was until my phone, powered back on out of habit, lit up with the aftermath of everything I'd set in motion. More missed calls. More voicemails. Texts that swung wildly between anger, confusion, bargaining, and desperation. I didn't open them yet. I made coffee instead, stood by the window, and watched people in the parking lot load cars with foil-covered dishes and paper bags, kids bouncing with excitement, adults already stressed. Somewhere across the state, my family was preparing the same ritual without me, trying to perform normalcy like muscle memory, even as the foundation under their feet continued to crumble. I knew enough about my mother to picture it clearly. Her insisting everything was fine, her voice just a little too tight, her movements sharper than usual as she tried to regain control through sheer force of will. The real unraveling began mid-morning, right on schedule. Mark's anger finally collided with reality when his bank froze his account pending verification. He couldn't provide without me. He left a voicemail so loud it distorted, accusing me of sabotaging him, of being jealous, of always resenting his success. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny but because it was familiar. Any boundary I'd ever tried to set had always been reframed as jealousy or insecurity, a convenient way to avoid accountability. Emily followed with a message that was all tears and panic. saying her landlord was threatening legal action, that she didn't understand why I was doing this to her. That family doesn't abandon each other like this. That one landed differently, not because it was more convincing, but because it exposed the irony so perfectly. Abandonment, to them, only existed when support stopped flowing outward from me. My exclusion, my humiliation, my erasure from the holiday apparently didn't qualify. By early afternoon, Mom called from the house, and I could hear Thanksgiving happening behind her voice. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of the television, the forced cheer she put on when she thought someone else might be listening. She left a long message, careful and measured, as if choosing each word could reverse what was already happening. She said she didn't know why I was reacting like this, said her text had been taken out of context, said I was punishing everyone over a misunderstanding. When she finally acknowledged the message, she softened it instantly, claiming it had been meant to cool things down, because I'd been tense lately. Hearing her rewrite it so easily, so instinctively, something inside me hardened. This wasn't new behavior. This was the same pattern she'd used my entire life. Provoke, deny, minimize, then guilt. The only difference now was that it wasn't working. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Thanksgiving itself was about to expose just how dependent they'd become. The grocery run that morning had already been a disaster. The shared card declined, forcing Mom to borrow money from a neighbor she'd spent years subtly looking down on. The oven malfunctioned because the maintenance plan I'd renewed annually had lapsed. Mark showed up late, flustered, furious, and embarrassed after nearly being arrested during a traffic stop when his insurance didn't show up in the system. Emily arrived in tears, barely holding herself together, and instead of rallying around her like they usually did, everyone was too stressed to perform empathy. Hunger, cold, and fear stripped the polish off the family dynamic, revealing something raw and ugly underneath. At some point, Mom tried to call me again, right there at the table. I imagined her stepping into the hallway, lowering her voice, trying to regain authority through proximity, through the assumption that I would pick up because holidays were sacred, because family was everything. I let it ring. I pictured the moment she realized I wasn't going to answer, the flicker of panic she wouldn't show anyone else, the way her shoulders would stiffen as she straightened herself before walking back into the room. Control, once cracked, is hard to restore, especially in front of witnesses. As the day wore on, the stress turned inward. Mark and Mom argued quietly at first, then louder, accusations slipping out between clenched teeth. Emily cried in the bathroom, texting me apologies mixed with blame, promising to talk to Mom if I would just fix things. None of them asked what I needed. None of them acknowledged how it must have felt to be dismissed so casually, so cruelly. Their focus remained locked on restoration, not repair, on getting things back to how they were, not on understanding why they'd broken. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Late in the afternoon, I finally opened one voicemail I hadn't listened to yet, one that had come in earlier from a number I didn't recognize. It was from my mother's lawyer, his tone formal but urgent, asking me to return the call regarding some irregularities that had surfaced in the family accounts. I replayed it twice, a slow smile spreading across my face. This was the point of no return. The moment where the situation escalated beyond emotional manipulation and into documented reality. Lawyers don't deal in guilt or tradition. They deal in facts, permissions, signatures. And facts in this case were firmly on my side. I spent the rest of Thanksgiving evening alone, ordering food, watching a movie I barely paid attention to, letting the phone buzz intermittently on the counter. The chaos unfolding elsewhere felt distant, like a storm I'd already passed through. I knew they would regroup. I knew they would shift strategies, from panic to pressure to confrontation. But I also knew something fundamental had changed. They could no longer pretend I was optional. And the irony of that it took my absence, my silence, for my presence to finally be felt, wasn't lost on me. When night fell and the calls slowed, I sat back and thought about Dad, about the way he used to watch family arguments from the edge of the room, saying nothing, absorbing everything. I wondered if he'd known this day would come, if he'd seen the imbalance long before I did. The thought stayed with me as I turned off the lights and went to bed, aware that the next phase wouldn't be quiet at all. Thanksgiving had stripped away the illusion. What came next would expose the truth underneath it. The shift from panic to strategy happened faster than I expected, because fear in my family has always had a way of turning into coordination when control is threatened, and the morning after Thanksgiving I woke to a different kind of silence, the kind that feels temporary, deliberate, like the deep breath someone takes before deciding how to strike back. My phone had fewer missed calls, but the messages that were waiting carried a sharper edge, less emotional, more calculated. Mom texted first, calm and almost polite, saying we needed to sit down like adults and clear up some misunderstandings, as if what she'd done was a clerical error rather than a deliberate humiliation. Mark followed with a message that tried to sound reasonable, but couldn't hide the resentment underneath, saying this had gone too far, that I was hurting everyone over a single comment, that family disputes shouldn't be handled through money. Emily's message was the most revealing of all, a long paragraph where she apologized without actually apologizing, acknowledging that Mom's text might have been harsh, while insisting that I knew how Mom was, that I should have been the bigger person, that withdrawing support was cruel. Reading it, I felt that familiar pull, the one that had dragged me back into compliance countless times before, the suggestion that my pain was valid only until it inconvenienced someone else. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I called my own lawyer, a woman I'd worked with years earlier during Dad's estate process, someone who knew the family dynamics without being entangled in them. I told her everything, from the text message to the canceled accounts to the voicemail from Mom's attorney. She listened without interrupting, then said something that lodged itself firmly in my chest. You didn't cause this. You stopped preventing it. That distinction mattered. I hadn't created chaos. I'd simply stepped aside and let the systems I'd been propping up behave as they naturally would in the absence of constant intervention. She advised me to document everything, to keep communication minimal, to let formal channels handle what emotions could not. Hanging up, I felt steadier than I had in days, grounded by the knowledge that for once, I wasn't navigating this alone or blind. By noon, the pressure escalated. Mom's lawyer called again, this time less formal, his voice tight with concern as he explained that several accounts were under review and that some trust distributions had been flagged. He asked if I'd intentionally withdrawn from my role as administrator for certain payments. I told him the truth. I had withdrawn from any obligations that were never legally mine to begin with. There was a pause on the line, the kind that speaks louder than words, followed by a careful acknowledgement that he would need to review the documents more closely. When the call ended, I knew they were starting to realize just how much of their stability had been built on assumptions rather than agreements. The family meeting Mom had proposed came next, though not as a request but as an expectation. She wanted to meet at the house, the same place where every confrontation in my life had been staged to favor her. Surrounded by familiar walls, familiar power dynamics, familiar pressure to conform. I declined and suggested a neutral location instead, a quiet cafe near the courthouse. That alone felt like a small act of rebellion, and her response was immediate and icy. She accused me of being dramatic, of dragging outsiders into private matters, of disrespecting her. I didn't argue. I simply repeated the location and time and said I'd be there if they wanted to talk. The loss of control was starting to show through the cracks in her words. When they arrived the next day, they came together just like always, a united front formed by necessity rather than loyalty. Mom walked in first, chin high, eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to judge her. Mark followed, tense and restless, already radiating anger. Emily trailed behind them, eyes red, clutching her phone like a lifeline. I was already seated, coffee untouched, a slim folder resting on the table in front of me. That folder was the reason I'd agreed to meet at all. They didn't notice it at first. Mom launched into her speech immediately, framing the situation as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, accusing me of overreacting, of punishing the family instead of communicating. She talked about respect, about loyalty, about how hurt she was by my silence. At no point did she apologize for the text. At no point did she acknowledge how it might have felt to read it. I let her talk. I let Mark jump in with his own grievances, accusing me of pulling some kind of power move, of enjoying the chaos, of always thinking I was better than them. I let Emily cry and plead and ask why I couldn't just turn everything back on and deal with the emotional stuff later. And then when the noise finally burned itself out, I slid the folder across the table. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from any silence we'd shared before, heavier, more alert. Inside were copies of account statements, payment histories, authorization forms, and correspondence stretching back years, all meticulously organized. I watched their expressions shift as they flipped through the pages, confusion giving way to discomfort, then to something closer to fear. That's when I told them what I'd never said out loud before. I told them how much I'd been covering, how long it had been going on, how many times I'd stepped in without being asked because I knew no one else would. I told them that none of it had ever been my responsibility, that I'd done it because I believed family meant mutual care, not because I owed them. Mom tried to interrupt, to reframe, to insist that this was what family does, but the words felt hollow now, stripped of their emotional leverage by the evidence in front of her. Mark scoffed, muttering that money didn't matter, that this was about principle, but his hands shook as he turned the pages. Emily stopped crying altogether, her face pale as realization settled in. The truth they weren't ready for yet, the one sitting just beneath the surface, was that this wasn't even the full picture. There were documents in that folder that I hadn't asked them to read yet, papers tied not just to their present discomfort but to the future they'd been counting on. Dad's estate had been more complicated than they knew, and his trust had been structured with safeguards none of them had bothered to understand because I'd always handled it. Safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of misuse, exactly this kind of entitlement. As they sat there, grappling with the immediate consequences of my withdrawal, they still believed this was a temporary standoff, a conflict that could be negotiated away once emotions cooled. They didn't yet realize they were standing on the edge of something permanent. When the meeting ended, it did so without resolution. Mom left angry, accusing me of betrayal. Mark left seething, already talking about legal action he didn't fully understand. Emily lingered, asking quietly if there was any way to fix this, if we could go back to how things were. I looked at her and felt a sadness that surprised me, not because I missed the old dynamic, but because I could see how deeply she'd been shaped by it. I told her the truth, gently but firmly. Going back was no longer an option. The systems had been exposed. The imbalance had been named. And once that happens, pretending otherwise is just another form of lying. As I walked out of the cafe, the air felt colder, sharper, like winter announcing itself early. I knew the next move wouldn't come from Mom directly. She'd always preferred proxies when things got serious. Lawyers. Threats. Documents. The kind of weapons that carry authority without emotion. And somewhere in the middle of that legal maneuvering lay the final truth, the one my father had hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to protect me. The letter arrived 3 days later, thick cream paper inside a stiff envelope, my name typed formally across the front like a challenge rather than an address, and the return label from my mother's lawyer confirmed what I'd already felt in my bones when I pulled it from the mailbox. This was no longer a family argument pretending to be emotional. It was a power struggle pretending to be legal. I didn't open it right away. I carried it upstairs, set it on the kitchen counter, and stood there for a long moment, staring at it as if it might start speaking on its own. Growing up, legal threats had always been Mom's nuclear option, the move she reserved for moments when guilt failed and authority slipped. She loved the weight of official language, the way it could make her sound righteous without requiring her to be right. When I finally opened the envelope, the contents were exactly what I expected and somehow still disappointing. Accusations of financial coercion, claims that I'd acted in bad faith, suggestions that my withdrawal of support constituted abuse of authority. It was written to intimidate, not to persuade, and as I read it, a strange calm settled over me. Fear had powered this family for decades, but fear only works when you believe you're alone. I wasn't. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer with a brief note and went about my day. That was the part that would have infuriated my mother the most if she'd known. Not the refusal, but the normalcy. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I slept well. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the situation accelerated in ways even I hadn't fully anticipated. The moment Mom's lawyer began poking at the accounts, the deeper mechanisms Dad had put in place stirred awake. Audits triggered automatically. Flags were raised. Requests for documentation multiplied. Years of quiet financial drift were suddenly being examined under fluorescent scrutiny, and the picture that emerged wasn't flattering. Money had moved where it shouldn't have. Funds intended for long-term stability had been used to patch over short-term irresponsibility. None of it illegal in isolation, But together it told a story of systematic misuse that contradicted the narrative Mom had always sold. That she was barely holding things together, that sacrifices had been made, that everyone had done their best. Mark felt it first. He called me late one night, his voice stripped of its usual bluster, asking if I knew why his access to certain trust-linked funds had been frozen pending review. He tried to sound casual, but the desperation leaked through the cracks, especially when he admitted he was already behind on multiple payments and creditors were circling. I told him the truth, calmly and without accusation. I hadn't frozen anything. The trust had safeguards, and once scrutiny began, those safeguards did what they were designed to do. He cursed, accused me of setting him up, of always judging him, of secretly wanting him to fail. Listening to him spiral, I realized how deeply he'd internalized the idea that consequences were something that happened to other people, not him. When the call ended, it wasn't anger I felt, but a quiet grief for the brother I'd never really had, the one who might have existed if accountability had ever been allowed to touch him. Emily came next, not with accusations but with fear. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, eyes hollow, hands shaking as she explained that her landlord had started eviction proceedings, and that Mom had told her everything would be fixed soon, just like always. She asked me if that was true. The question cut deeper than any insult, because it revealed how completely she'd been trained to believe rescue was inevitable. I told her gently that I couldn't promise that anymore, that things were changing whether any of us liked it or not. She broke down then, crying in a way that felt less performative than her usual crises, and for a moment I considered stepping back in, cushioning the fall like I always had. But then I remembered the text message, the ease with which I'd been erased, and I understood something crucial. Rescuing her again wouldn't save her, it would only delay the moment she learned to stand. When she left, she hugged me tightly, like someone clinging to the last familiar thing in a collapsing world, and whispered that she was scared. I told her I knew. The real rupture came when my lawyer called me into her office and slid a document across the table that I hadn't seen before, something she'd uncovered while reviewing the trust structure more closely. It was an amendment signed by Dad 6 months before he died, legally binding and devastating in its clarity. In it, he outlined specific conditions under which discretionary distributions could be suspended, including evidence of mismanagement, coercion, or exploitation of another beneficiary. He named me executor not because I was the most obedient, but because I was the most observant. Reading his words, written in that familiar, precise tone he used when he wanted to be absolutely understood, felt like hearing his voice again after years of silence. He hadn't been blind. He'd seen the patterns forming, the way Mom leaned on me too heavily, the way Mark took without shame, the way Emily was encouraged to remain dependent. And he'd planned accordingly. What shook me wasn't the power the document gave me, but the realization that Dad had expected this moment, had anticipated the need for protection long before I'd been willing to admit it. The trust didn't just freeze funds, it required an independent review, one that would examine years of transactions and determine whether the family had acted in good faith. Until that review was complete, no discretionary money would flow. My lawyer looked at me and said quietly that once this process began, there was no undoing it, no family appeal that could reverse it through emotional pressure. This wasn't a punishment I was imposing. It was a mechanism my father had built, waiting patiently for the right conditions to activate. When Mom found out, she didn't call me. She showed up at my apartment, unannounced and furious, pounding on the door like she could force reality to bend through sheer will. When I opened it, her face was flushed, eyes wild, all pretense gone. She accused me of conspiring against her, of manipulating Dad, of stealing what belonged to the family. She shouted about sacrifice, about everything she'd endured, about how ungrateful I was. I listened until she ran out of breath, then told her evenly that none of this would be happening if she hadn't sent that text, if she hadn't assumed I would always absorb whatever she dished out. The words hit her harder than any accusation could have, because they reframed the story she'd been telling herself. This wasn't my rebellion. It was her miscalculation. She left without another word, but the damage was done. The trust review moved forward. Lawyers took over. Lines were drawn not by emotion but by documentation. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that the family I'd grown up in was about to confront something it had avoided for generations. the cost of its own entitlement. The hidden truth was no longer hidden, and the final phase was approaching, one that would force each of us to reckon not just with money, but with who we were without it. The investigation didn't announce itself with drama or raised voices. It arrived the way all real consequences do. Quietly, methodically, wrapped in neutral language that left no room for argument. Notices were sent. Requests for records followed. Timelines were reconstructed. Every temporary transfer, every unexplained withdrawal, every account that had quietly shifted from necessity into convenience was laid out on clean white pages by people who had no emotional investment in protecting anyone's self-image. Watching it unfold from the outside felt surreal, like observing my family through glass while professionals dismantled the story we'd been telling ourselves for years. Mom tried to fight it at first, insisting the review was unnecessary, claiming she'd been acting in everyone's best interest, but the more she pushed, the more resistance she met. Institutions don't respond to volume or guilt. They respond to evidence. And the evidence was finally speaking for itself. Mark unraveled next. Without access to trust distributions and with creditors closing in, his bravado collapsed into something ugly and frantic. He called me repeatedly, swinging between rage and desperation, accusing me of ruining his life one moment and begging for help the next. When that didn't work, he showed up at my apartment late one evening, pacing the hallway, voice low and intense as he told me I was obligated to fix this because I was family. He said Dad would be ashamed of me, that I was hiding behind paperwork to avoid doing the right thing. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw a man who had never learned to associate effort with outcome, someone who believed resources existed to be accessed rather than earned. I told him the truth I'd never said aloud before, that I had spent years cleaning up after his choices, and that I was done. The silence that followed was thick, not because he was reflecting, but because for the first time, there was no argument he could use to escape responsibility. He left without another word, and I knew that whatever relationship we might have had was ending right there in that hallway. Emily's transformation was quieter, more painful in its own way. Stripped of the constant rescue she'd come to rely on, she was forced to confront her own instability head-on. She took a second job. She started asking questions she'd never needed to ask before. Sometimes she called me just to talk, not to ask for money or favors, but to admit she was scared, that she didn't know who she was without someone fixing things for her. Those conversations were hard, but they were real, more honest than anything we'd shared growing up. I didn't save her. I didn't offer solutions. I listened, and slowly something shifted. She stopped framing herself as a victim of circumstances and started seeing how those circumstances had been maintained. Watching her struggle was uncomfortable, but it also felt necessary, like a wound finally being cleaned instead of covered. Mom, meanwhile, retreated into a version of herself I'd only seen glimpses of before, cold and calculating, convinced that if she could just outmaneuver the process, everything would go back to normal. She hired another lawyer. She accused the reviewers of bias. She tried to rally extended family members, painting herself as a betrayed widow, a mother abandoned by her ungrateful son. Some of them believed her, at least at first. I received messages from relatives I barely spoke to, urging me to be reasonable, to remember blood is thicker than money. I didn't respond. I'd learned by now that people who benefit from dysfunction are often the loudest defenders of it. The truth doesn't need allies when it has structure. Weeks passed. The review concluded. Findings were issued in careful, devastating language that avoided blame while making the conclusions impossible to misinterpret. Mismanagement had occurred. Distributions had been used in ways that undermined the trust's purpose. As a result, long-term controls would be imposed. Funds would be restricted, oversight increased, and certain benefits permanently reduced. It wasn't total ruin. It was something worse for people like my family: accountability. No dramatic collapse, no cinematic downfall, just a steady narrowing of options until reality could no longer be avoided. The day Mom received the final notice, she didn't scream or threaten or accuse. She called me and asked to meet. Her voice sounded older, stripped of its usual authority, and for the first time I heard uncertainty in it. We met at the same cafe as before, but the energy was different. She didn't lecture. She didn't cry. She said she didn't recognize the world she was in anymore. That everything felt smaller, tighter. that she'd never imagined things could change so fast. I listened, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of weary clarity. I told her this wasn't something that had happened overnight, that it was the result of years of choices layered one on top of another, all made under the assumption that I would always absorb the impact. I told her that the text she sent wasn't the cause of all this, but it was the moment that made me stop pretending it was normal. She asked me then quietly if there was any way to fix it. Not to reverse the trust decision, not to get the money back, but to fix us. The question hung between us, heavy and unresolved. I thought about the years of emotional injury, the subtle humiliations, the way love in our family had always been conditional on obedience. I thought about Dad, about the foresight he'd shown, about the protection he'd tried to offer me even from beyond the grave. And I realized that repair wasn't something I could do alone, and it wasn't something I was obligated to attempt on her timeline. I told her the truth, that fixing things would require accountability, not just regret, and that I wasn't sure she was ready for that yet. When we parted, there were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations, just distance. And for the first time, that distance felt honest. I walked away knowing that whatever came next wouldn't be driven by fear or obligation, but by choice. The systems had done their work. The truth was out. All that remained was the reckoning each of us would have to face individually, without the illusion that someone else would always step in to soften the fall. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It seeped into everything slowly, changing the texture of my days in ways I hadn't anticipated. Because even when you choose distance, history doesn't vanish, it echoes, and Section 7 was where those echoes finally demanded to be heard. With the trust review finalized and the legal dust settling, the external pressure eased, but the emotional consequences intensified, spreading outward through extended family, old friendships, and even parts of myself I hadn't realized were still wired for obligation. Relatives who'd once been distant suddenly felt entitled to opinions, calling to lecture me about forgiveness while carefully avoiding any discussion of accountability, and I noticed how consistently their advice aligned with their own comfort rather than any genuine concern for my well-being. At the same time, Mom's version of events continued to circulate, refined now, less explosive, more tragic, painting her as a woman blindsided by a son who'd chosen money over love, and while I knew better than to engage directly, there were moments, quiet ones late at night, when the weight of being misunderstood pressed hard against my chest. That was when the hidden truth my father had left behind began to surface in ways I hadn't expected, not through documents or lawyers, but through memory. I started replaying moments from my childhood with new clarity. The way Dad would linger in the room after arguments, the looks he gave me when Mom spoke over me, the rare but deliberate encouragements he offered when no one else was listening. Those memories reframed the amendment he'd written, transforming it from a legal safeguard into a final act of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he'd seen the role I was forced into and wanted me protected from it once he was gone. That realization hit hardest during an unexpected call from his old financial advisor, a man I barely remembered, who reached out to clarify a procedural detail and then, hesitantly, told me Dad had worried about me more than anyone else, that he'd mentioned feeling guilty for not intervening sooner, for letting responsibility fall on me because I was strong enough to handle it. Hearing that cracked something open in me, not because it excused the past, but because it confirmed I hadn't imagined the imbalance or its cost. Meanwhile, the family dynamic continued to fracture in revealing ways. Mark's anger hardened into bitterness, his world shrinking as options closed, and though he threatened lawsuits and reconciliation in equal measure, neither ever materialized because both required effort he wasn't prepared to make. Emily, on the other hand, surprised me, slowly disentangling herself from Mom's orbit, making small imperfect choices toward independence, calling less often but speaking more honestly when she did. And though our relationship remained strained, it felt real for the first time, no longer built on rescue but on shared vulnerability. Mom withdrew almost completely, her attempts at control replaced by silence, and when she did reach out, it was tentative, uncertain, as if she no longer trusted the ground beneath her authority. The moral reversal I'd been waiting for arrived quietly one evening when I realized that the guilt I'd carried for years, the sense that I was responsible for everyone's happiness, had begun to dissolve, replaced not by anger but by relief. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't celebrating their discomfort. I was simply free, and that freedom reframed everything. The Thanksgiving text, the missed calls, the legal threats, All of it now felt like symptoms of a system that had depended on my silence to survive. As the final weeks of the year approached, I understood that the real climax wasn't about money or revenge, but about identity, about choosing who I was allowed to be outside the role my family had assigned me, and that understanding set the stage for the last truth still waiting to surface, the one that would close this chapter completely and determine whether reconciliation was even possible, not on their terms but on mine. The final truth arrived not with confrontation or paperwork, but with a moment so quiet it almost felt ordinary, and that was fitting, because the most decisive endings rarely announce themselves with drama. It happened on a cold evening months later, when I was going through a box of my father's old belongings that my mother had finally agreed to release, a small concession that felt less like generosity and more like surrender. Most of it was mundane. Manuals, faded receipts, a watch that no longer worked. But at the bottom of the box was a thin notebook I didn't recognize, its cover worn soft from use. Inside were pages of my father's handwriting, careful and precise. Not a diary exactly, but notes, observations, fragments of thought he'd never shared out loud. As I read, a complete picture formed, one I hadn't known I was missing. He wrote about watching the family dynamic shift over the years, about how my mother's fear of instability had turned into control, how Mark's entitlement had been enabled because conflict was easier to avoid than correction, how Emily had been protected into helplessness. And then there were pages about me. He wrote about my sense of duty, about how early I'd learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced, how proud he was of my competence and how worried he was that it came at the cost of my own life. One line stopped me completely. If I don't put this in writing, they will drain him dry and call it love. That was the hidden truth laid bare at last. The trust amendment hadn't been a reaction to anything specific, it had been a safeguard born of long observation, a final act of parenting meant to protect the one child who never asked to be protected. Sitting there with that notebook in my hands, I felt a grief deeper than anything I'd felt during the legal battles, because it wasn't mixed with anger or adrenaline, just clarity. My father had seen what I hadn't been ready to see, and he tried to give me an exit long before I realized I needed one. That understanding changed the shape of everything that followed. When my mother eventually asked to meet one last time, not to argue or negotiate, but simply to talk, I agreed, not out of obligation, but because I knew I no longer needed anything from her to be whole. We met at a park near her house, neutral ground again, the late afternoon light casting long shadows between us. She looked smaller somehow, not physically but energetically, like someone who'd spent a lifetime pushing against reality and finally run out of leverage. She didn't defend herself this time. She didn't minimize or rewrite. She admitted haltingly that she'd relied on me because it was easy, because I never said no, because my competence made her feel safe without forcing her to change. She admitted she'd sent the Thanksgiving text to assert control, not realizing that control only works until the person being controlled stops caring. I listened, not with forgiveness ready-made, but without the old ache to be understood. When she asked if I could ever forgive her, I told her the truth. Forgiveness wasn't a switch and reconciliation wasn't guaranteed just because regret existed. What I could offer was honesty and distance, a relationship without hidden expectations, if she was willing to accept that I was no longer the son who would silently absorb everything. She nodded, not agreeing so much as accepting that the terms had changed permanently. Mark never showed up again, not to apologize or to fight. His world narrowed until it fit exactly the effort he was willing to give, and while part of me mourned the brother I'd wished for, another part understood that some relationships end not with explosions, but with absence. Emily continued forward in fits and starts, sometimes stumbling, sometimes surprising herself, and though we weren't close in the way siblings in movies are, we were honest and that was enough. As for me, the quiet that followed felt different from any silence I'd known before. It wasn't tense or anticipatory. It was earned. I spent that next Thanksgiving alone by choice, cooking a simple meal, calling a friend afterward, feeling no pull toward the chaos I'd left behind. When my phone stayed silent, it didn't feel like rejection. Felt like peace. The karmic twist, the one that tied everything together, revealed itself slowly over time. By removing myself, I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd forced it to confront itself. The systems my father built, the boundaries I finally enforced, all of it ensured that no one could continue as they had without paying the real cost. And in that reckoning, each of us became exactly as strong, or as fragile as we truly were. I wasn't the villain they'd briefly painted me to be, and I wasn't the savior they'd relied on either. I was simply a son who chose to stop confusing responsibility with love. That choice didn't make me lonely. It made me whole. And when I think back to that midnight text now, I no longer feel the sting of it. I feel gratitude, because in trying to banish me from one holiday, my mother unintentionally gave me my life back. Friends, if you liked our story, then be sure to like and comment on the video. And to watch such story videos, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you will receive our new content every day.